And that is that the library, I think, keeps that on file in case somebody wasn't able to make it to the lecture, and then they can watch it later. But my name is Andrea Reynolds, and I am an assistant professor and director of field education at Lincoln University. I've been there for about 3 years, and I have been doing adoption work for about 8 years now, 8.5 actually now. And so thank you so much to the Missouri River Regional Library and Dr. Christine Boston, who put this lecture series together. And thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. So this will be kind of informal. There's going to be different sections where I ask for crowd input and thought. So feel free to jump in at any point in time. During that, I am going to attempt to share my screen. Dr. Boston has also offered to watch the chat box for me. So if you would like to ask a question in the chat or make a comment in the chat, she will share those kind of throughout as well. And that would be great. So any participation you want to do would be more than welcomed. So I'm not great with technology, but I am going to try to share my screen here and we'll get started on the actual presentation. Okay, good deal. So that was kind of my introduction of myself. And so I was kind of curious, what kinds of movies or literatures are you all aware of that have the theme of adoption in it? Okay, that one can be a little tricky. The first one that comes to my mind is Juno. That was popular several years ago, and that had a kind of what you would consider like your typical, it was your typical adoption situation. It was a teen pregnancy, and she was going to place her child for adoption. So that is, and book-wise, I really don't know of a whole lot that aren't more academic literature type pieces that people would read just for fun that are pretty popular.
Hey, Andy, there's a couple of people posting in the chat. So someone mentioned Annie, which was the musical turned movie. I'm assuming as much. Losing Isaiah, I'm not so familiar with that one. And then Instant Family. And I was actually going to pop in and talk about, there was a movie several years ago, I think had Madonna in it. And she got pregnant by a guy friend, and there was a whole sorts of thing about the adoption of the child in regards to him and her and other things. I could be completely off base because this was back when I was a teenager, and that was in a previous millennium, we'll just say.
So those are great ones. You guys thought of a lot of really good ones. Instant Family, I did see that. I waited till it came out on video. My students will tell you I am the worst at pop culture. They ask me all kinds of questions about, have you seen, did you watch? And I'm like, no, have not seen that. So Annie is a good one. That's a much older, like you said, movie turned musical that probably a lot of people are aware of. So you can kind of, looking at those of the ones you've seen or not seen, and again, there were no books mentioned in there, that you can kind of see some differences in there. The Annie adoption is very different from the foster care situation in Instant Family, very different from the teen pregnancy situation in Juno. So very good, you guys are good. Trying to get to my next slide, there we go. Let's see then. We've also got, so this is kind of what we're going to talk about tonight, in case you were wondering. So we're going to talk a little bit about the education that's needed for the field of adoption, the different types of adoption, the process, and adoption planning purposes. The agency that I've worked for, we do all of these different types of things. My particular role might be slightly different. And so I may not know 100% about a specific question, and if not, I am going to put my email address in the chat box, don't let me forget, by the end. So in case there was questions that didn't get answered or you want more information about something, I would be happy to share that type of stuff with you. No problem. So obviously, I am a social worker by trade and education. So I would highly encourage anyone who's interested in working in the adoption field to pursue a degree, either a bachelor's in social work or a master's in social work. One of the reasons that I say that is because it makes you a lot more marketable within that particular field. I know that my supervisor that I had for several years, she was not a social worker. And I swear she told me at least twice a year, I really wish I had gotten my social work degree. She's wonderful at her job. And actually she holds a much higher position now within our agency. I mean, she does an excellent job. But she was always said she knew that she could make more money if she had gotten her master's in social work as opposed to the degree that she did have. And she also just wanted to be able to do more things than kind of what she felt kind of pigeonholed into. So with social work, we do kind of across the board. We can do with individuals, couples, families. We work with all of these different sectors and aspects. We work with communities. We work with politics and lawmaking. We do all different kinds of things. So if you have a heart for adoption, but maybe you also are really interested in community planning, you can kind of merge those two different things together. So that's a really cool piece about being a social worker within this particular field. My specific role within my agency is very people focused. I do a lot of home studies, post-placement, adoption studies. I do a little bit of birth parent counseling. I am the very first to say that is not my forte. It is not where my heart particularly lies. It is not where my skill set particularly lies either. But I really love working with our adoptive families. And I have learned a lot from working with our birth families as well. But you can also have a degree in the human services field and easily work within adoption. I think a lot of people have that. So this is another participant question. So can you tell me what words come to mind when you hear the word adoption? Nobody? Okay, nobody has any thoughts about, oh, okay, I see some coming through. Christine's gonna help me.
I'd say lifelong commitment.
Absolutely, that's a good one. Definitely, it's not something you can give up on very easily. Just to share some anecdotes, there are places within the United States that do what is called rehoming, and that is if a family is placed with a child and then they find that it's really difficult, because it is really difficult. But if they feel like the child is beyond something that they are able to handle, have gone through multiple step process in terms of staying together in that adoptive family, there are homes that the children can go to that are kind of more institutionalized setting. Obviously, that's not something we would hope for any of our children.
Some additional comments, Andy, are money, siblings, forever home, compassion, providing a safe environment. And then as Ricky mentioned, that he actually has several adopted siblings.
Oh, interesting. Very good. Yeah. Siblings. I love to talk about the sibling groups because I feel like that is something that definitely gets overlooked. Oftentimes when I do home studies, I will say to our prospective adoptive parents, so what will you do if the child has siblings? And they kind of go, because it just hasn't really crossed their mind. But very often they come into our agency, and the child will come into our agency and they already have birth siblings. And a lot of times then they will even, mom will have a sibling afterwards. And we have had a number of cases where mom has placed a baby with one of our families, and then mom will contact that family again and say, hey, I'm expecting again. Are you interested in having this baby as well? And so that's always really interesting when those things come to fruition. And also the sibling, I am a very big proponent of keeping siblings together whenever possible for a number of different reasons. But one is just kind of having that connection to the biological family that's right there. And I like to keep them together. I'm a big fan of siblings. Money, yes, we will talk a little bit about that later because obviously I think that is a big barrier, I would say, for people who are interested in adoption. And that is one of the things that keeps people from adopting because it can be fairly costly. Let's see, a safe environment, a safe home. Yes, that is obviously something that we strive for. I tell all of our adoptive families when I go in, I do a very lengthy home study process with them. And I always say, like, I'm not here to be judging you, but I am here to make sure that a child that we place in your home is coming to the safest, healthiest place that we can possibly place them in. And that is, again, that's why we do that. We have a lot of paperwork and a lot of home visits and a lot of requirements for our families to become adoptive families. If anybody has been through that process, you might know how strenuous and time consuming that process can be. Let's see. So somebody already mentioned that they have adoptive siblings. So again, this is one of those questions as well. Does anybody else know of someone that has been adopted or has adopted or anything of that nature? Okay, see a couple hands raised here and there. The statistics show that typically 50% of the population have some connection with adoption. So whether that be that they have like a brother or sister who adopted, whether they themselves have adopted, if their grandparents adopted, like it's really fascinating that once you kind of start talking about it, that people will be able to say, oh, I was adopted. And there are people who you maybe have known for years who, if the subject has never come up, you would never know that they were adopted. So I think that that's always really interesting when you start to talk about it, the more and more you make those connections with people who have the adoption connection as well. Didn't go. There we go. And so why do you think that families choose to adopt? What do you guys think are the top reasons?
Shay just mentioned infertility.
Absolutely. Number one reason, Shay, good job. I had a home study that I did one time with a family, and the wife said to me, well, she said, well, I don't think that that's the main, I don't think infertility is why people adopt. And I was like, oh, actually it is. That's the main reason people choose to adopt. And I think a lot of that comes from when we're growing up. I think very few people think to themselves that they're not going to be able to have biological children. And so that isn't really something that people consider to be like a part of the natural life cycle, that they wouldn't be able to have biological children. But infertility, if I asked you how many of you know someone who's been affected by infertility, potentially about 50 to 75% of the hands would go up as well. And I think that that is something that we're seeing more and more often. And I don't know if it's because we're seeing it more often or if people are talking about it more often, but it's definitely a factor in why people adopt.
Amber mentioned faith as well as a reason for adopting.
Yes, I think that's very prominent as well. A lot of agencies are faith-based, and a lot of churches talk a lot about the call to care for the orphaned and the widowed. And this is, a lot of churches promote it. A lot of churches assist with financial pieces of it or other aspects of the adoption. So that's absolutely. I think some of the others are people want to provide a home for an international child, an international orphan. People feel like, you know, in other countries that maybe a baby was just left on a doorstep or something of that nature, which I think did happen a lot in years past. I don't think that is something we're seeing happen as much with the international countries that we're working with currently. And some people want to parent a child or feel called to parent a child with special needs. And so a lot of the countries that we work with, if you are interested in parenting a child with special needs, there's like a process that has to be done, but if you are interested in parenting a child with special needs, you go to the top of the list. Like if you just want, you know, we call it openness. So if you're not open to like a child who has all these special medical needs, you would maybe be a lot further down on the list to get matched and paired with a child. And interestingly, a lot of the special needs are things that in the United States are very easily medically managed. Some of it may just be medication on a daily basis. A family that I worked with they waited for 8 years and they adopted a little girl from China. And she had some minor gastrointestinal issue that had been taken care of via surgery in China. They didn't even have to medically manage it once they brought her back to the United States. So some of it is, you know, things that in a third world country or a country that doesn't have the same type of medical care that we do here in the United States, that it might seem very overwhelming and very complicated depending on what the medical system and everything looks like over there, to be enough for a parent to say, hey, I can't parent this child, I can't financially afford it, whatever that may look like. Other things that I've seen fairly often with our international kiddos is things like cleft lip and cleft palate, which again, as we know here in the United States, those are usually fairly easily correctable and are not a big deal. But in other countries, they can be. Let me see here. Okay, so why do children come to foster care? So we'll talk about state foster care adoption. So why do children come to foster care? Any thoughts on that?
Shay just mentioned abuse or neglect in the home.
Yep. Abuse and neglect, I think, is one of the first things that come to mind for people. And definitely that's one of the main reasons children enter the foster care system. And something that we are seeing a lot of currently and have been for a couple of years is extreme hard drug use. And that seems to kind of be a continuing trend at this stage in the game. And that does tend to kind of fluctuate. Sometimes it's not as high as others, but right now that's kind of the main reason that we're seeing on our end of parents who are interested, of birth parents who are interested in placing for adoption. And obviously the first goal of foster care is reunification with their birth family. And sometimes that will also, if it's not the birth mom or the birth father, it may be like a grandparent or an aunt. So it's still a biological family member. You can see some 2017 statistics there. You know, that was at this point several years ago. But it kind of gives you an idea of what things are looking like. And that is for the state of Missouri. And the average length of time before a child who is in the foster care becomes adoptable is 2 years. And so that sometimes is good information to know. I know several people who have or are in the process of adopting the foster care system. And I know one family that has been much longer than that. And another family that went a little longer than that with one of their children and went shorter with another child. So it does kind of run the gamut. And sometimes kiddos come into care and they are ready to be adopted fairly quickly. So inter-country adoption and global
Andy?
foster care. Yeah.
Andy, I wanted to ask you a quick question in regards to that length of time, just because I know people who have been adopted and people who are going through the process or interested in the process. Could you touch on why the average is 2 years? Because there are some legitimate reasons for that.
Yes, there absolutely is. And a lot of that depends on what is happening with the birth parents. And a lot of it is legalities. And again, because the goal at this point in the state of Missouri for foster care is reunification with the birth family, that is why it takes so long. Sometimes mom has signed over her parental rights, or dad has signed over his paternal rights, or sometimes like the parents are doing a little bit, they're doing enough, they're starting to have visits, maybe they miss a couple of visits, but they're still trying. And a lot of it is paperwork and red tape. You know, I was talked about that family. I was wondering that they've been, I don't even know how long. I know it's been at least 4 years that they have been, that they have had these children in their home and have not been able to adopt them. Occasionally kiddos do, even if they're in a foster home, they do go back to a birth family and then they come back to the foster family. That happens occasionally as well. A lot of it has to do with paperwork and that Missouri has the desire to reunify families. And a lot of it is dependent on the county that you live in, the judges that are there, all of those different legal pieces that come into play. it is definitely a lengthy process. Some kiddos, though, like I said, that they do come into care where both mom and dad have signed off on their parental rights, or maybe they have, maybe both parents have died, and there is no other family that's willing to take them in, that type of thing. And so sometimes those kiddos are very readily adoptable. So with the intercountry adoption and global foster care, again, we talked about the children with special needs. So a lot of the intercountry adoption is for children who have special needs. There are a lot of older children. A lot of people will say when I do home studies, well, we want to have a baby because we want to have like the full parental experience, which is completely understandable and fine. And then there are also sibling groups. So when I go in and do home studies, I always ask, are you open to a sibling group? And if so, how many? And that also doesn't just happen with intercountry adoption, that happens within the foster care and domestic adoption too. I've had several placements where we've placed sibling groups. I talked with my supervisor the other day because I wanted to clarify some trends that we are seeing. And this is one of them, is the global in-country programs. The inter-country adoption is actually becoming fewer and far between these days. And so they're doing more of these in-country programs. So where they're doing in-country adoption, much like we do domestic adoption here in the United States. They're also starting different foster care programs in different countries, which is really cool. And I know that our particular agency is helping in a couple of different countries to help set some of that system up, which is really interesting. And again, that family preservation of reunifying and supporting the family to be the best parents that they can be for that particular child. So those are some trends that we're seeing currently internationally. This is something that I enjoy talking about, and this is embryo adoption. So this gets a little like people don't always know that this is even an option for adoption. So this typically occurs when when families cannot achieve a pregnancy through in vitro fertilization, which is also known as IVF, that they occasionally will have embryos left over. So embryos that they chose not to use because they achieved pregnancy with a different embryo, or because they just decided this is not the path we want to take anymore, any number of reasons. But they sometimes have embryos left over. So they can keep them in storage indefinitely, which does cost money. They can have them destroyed, which, as somebody mentioned earlier, if you have a certain faith and religious beliefs, that would not be an option for certain couples. So that is one. And then you can donate them to research, or you can donate them to a family that could not otherwise have a baby. And so I have actually worked with two different families who have done embryo adoption. And it's really kind of interesting. It's all done very similarly to domestic adoption, but kind of in reverse. So you can see some information here that there's like 600,000 embryos in the world, apparently. There's no formal adoption. It is a contractual agreement. The adoptive family does have to have a home study completed, which is why I have worked with two families who have had that because I completed their home studies. And then openness is possible. So what will happen then is if, say, my husband and I wanted to adopt an embryo, we would contact an agency or a company that does that. And then we would have to create like a profile, what we consider to be a profile book, which would be like pictures of us, pictures of our family, pictures of our pets, pictures of our house, telling about the things that we like to do. This is what I do for a job. And then the family who had those embryos, who had created those embryos, they would get to look at our profile book and say, oh, we think those look like really nice people. Yes, that'd be great. They seem healthy. We want their embryo. So I had worked with two families who have done this. And it's really, really interesting. One of the reasons that I think that it is a nice option is that, again, if you have them stored, maybe you don't want to pay for those. For those with certain religious beliefs, again, they wouldn't want to necessarily destroy them, but then are you going to pay for them indefinitely? But I really like it too. I've had several clients who have said, well, I really want to be pregnant. I really want to experience what that's like. And I think, well, this is a really good option for that then. So there's a lot of screening and medical things that you have to do. And the last that I heard, there was only 3 places in the US that did the actual embryo transfer. And the closest one to us here in Missouri is in Knoxville, Tennessee. Okay. So domestic adoption is kind of what we think of when we think of that typical teen pregnancy. However, the age of the children can really vary. So it can be a baby. I have worked with, I think when we've placed like a 3-year-old before, it just really runs the gamut. The choice of release is always with the birth family. So sometimes it's the birth mother, sometimes it's the birth father, sometimes it's both of them working together. I worked a case where the lady, when she was married, she was a little bit older. I think she was in her 40s. She was married. It was both her and her husband's child, and her children were older, and her grandbaby had been born the week before, and she said, "I do not want to be a mother and a grandmother right now." And so that was her choice. And so that was. We always work with both the birth father and the birth mother, as long as we are able to reach the birth father. One of the things when somebody is facing an unplanned pregnancy is that it's always nice for that person to have somebody to talk to. So whether it be a friend, a family member, a professional, a pregnancy help center, for them to always be able to explore what all of their options are, so that for one, that they know what their options are, because sometimes people don't know. And for the other is to understand what the implications of each of their options. And sometimes there are certain options that you're like, no, that's not an option for you. Like that's not on the table for you for whatever reason in the life circumstance of the mom or the father. And everybody, of course, always thinks that they know what is best for the person, for the mama who's pregnant. But when we work with our birth mamas, we always talk to them about that they and they alone are the only ones who can make this decision. And so it's pretty heavy stuff working with these birth parents. Again, we do work with both the moms and the dads, and sometimes we work with grandparents when they're involved. So it can be a lot, and we prefer to work with a mama throughout her entire pregnancy and not meet her at the hospital when she's just given birth, but we do a lot of those placements as well, which is fine. Just curious, anybody want to guess the average cost for an adoption? I'm kind of curious what people think it is.
So 10,000, 10,000, 30,000 plus.
Terrific. Okay, guys. So it's usually anywhere between 20 and 40,000. A lot of that is to cover the cost of like the birth mom's medical expenses. A lot of that comes for that piece. There's also paperwork. And if you work with an agency, you have to pay somebody to do that paperwork. If you work with a lawyer, you have to pay the lawyer to do the paperwork. There's all of those kinds of things. So in Missouri, you cannot like go to a woman and say, I want to buy your baby. It does not work like that. That's not appropriate at all for a number of different reasons, but we are a state that doesn't allow that. We are also a state that doesn't allow for you, say you are adopting a child, you cannot say to that mom before the baby is here, hey, we'll do your rent. We will buy you a car. We will buy you a house to live in. You cannot do that in the state of Missouri. I think there are some other states that are a little bit more lax on those rules, but Missouri is definitely not one of those states. So it is expensive. I can tell you that when I had my last child, I was, because of when he was born and I switched jobs in there, I paid 3 separate deductibles for that birth alone. And I can tell you that cost easily around that same amount of money, that same figure that I told you. So it's because some people are like, that's crazy. Like that money is so expensive and that's why we don't do it. But there are obviously fees that go along with it. And it sometimes isn't more expensive than having a biological child. So there's not a lot of really great statistics on the number of adoptions. And I think some of that has to do with foster care, kinship adoption, independent adoptions that are done through lawyers. And then I think sometimes people just don't keep great statistics. But we do know that there's about 3 million unplanned pregnancies a year, and that 1.3 million of those end in abortion, and about 18,000 choose adoption. Going to my next one. Okay. And so why do you guys think some women choose to make an adoption plan?
Okay, so one person mentioned religion. Someone else mentioned wanting the child to have a quote better life.
Absolutely, those are both definitely reasons that we see. A lot of times we see families who just feel like they cannot provide financially. They feel like they can't provide stability with the point that they're at in their lives. But it really runs the gamut. People's life circumstances are very interesting and very complex. So I think life circumstance definitely plays into it, as do those reasons you all mentioned. We always keep the focus on asking the birth mama what she wants for her child. And their decisions are always based out of what they feel like is best for their child and not out of their own emotions. Because emotions, we all know sometimes you can't trust your own emotions. And so we work with our birth mamas quite a bit, again, about making a plan and why would you want to do this? If this circumstance was different, would you still want to make an adoption plan? And almost always, if we're able to work with a mama for the length of her pregnancy and we've done our jobs correctly, inevitably there usually comes a point in time where the mom's like, I don't know if this is what I want to do. Completely fair, completely understandable. And then we always go back and say, we talked about this. Is this different now? Is this different? Is there anything that's changed about this? And usually then they are able to kind of take a deep breath and realize again that they had made this plan for a reason, and that the reasons were all still valid and secure. And we do a lot of openness trainings with both our adoptive families and then with our birth parents when we can. And we highly encourage a lot of openness within adoption. So if you're not familiar with that term, many years, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but many years ago, it was like a closed book. You didn't know who your birth parents were. You didn't know where they were from. You didn't know anything about them. You knew nothing about them medically. And now we have families. I had a family one time that they were like, oh yeah, the birth mom and dad and the sibling, they all came over for the birthday party and stayed the night last weekend. And I was like, oh, okay. So it really runs the gamut of what that openness looks like. The openness is always driven by the birth parent. And we talk with our adoptive families too. I had mentioned a lot of substance use and abuse that we're seeing with our kiddos that are being placed with their birth families. And so we always talk with our adoptive families about doing what's for the best of the child. So if there's a circumstance where it's not safe for the child, then obviously we would discourage that. And they can always use us as the agency, as the go-between. We do a lot of like monitored visits, mostly because the birth parent will ask us to and say, I just feel a little uncomfortable and like, would you guys come with us? And we absolutely are happy to do that. But we encourage openness through the years. Like I said, sometimes it kind of ebbs and flows. And so there are points in times, when we do post placements, we follow a child after they have been placed with a family for 6 months. After that 6-month time period, they can formally and officially be adopted. Until that time, we visit them frequently. In the state of Missouri, I visit them 3 times within that 6 months, at 2 weeks, 3 months, and very close to 6 months. And I check in and do a whole host of different things, checking on mental health, on physical development, all around family adjustment, sibling adjustment, childcare arrangements, all of those types of things. But that is kind of a part that we do, is that post placement to make sure everybody's doing okay. And we hear a lot of different stories about what that openness has looked like, even in that ebbing and flowing in that 6-month time period. And so we do a lot of education with our families about what they can expect and what is normal, and maybe some things that are abnormal. And I think a lot of our families are happy to have that, to kind of have some of that knowledge base. Okay, so the adoption process. This is a little bit more, some of the top part of this is a little bit more of what my realm that I do. We require a home study. Most of the state of Missouri, as far as I know, does require a home study. Our particular home study process involves like a stack of paperwork this long. You have to do an application and gather all these documents. And I, as the home study practitioner, I see everything from a person's tax documents from the last 3 years to the most recent bank statement, to recommendations from friends and family, to I get to see the book reports that the adoptive parents wrote. I get to see school reports from, if there are already children in the home. It's like super intense, and having people in your business. And so that's a really interesting piece. So we do a ton of paperwork. So we do a lot of pre-screening. We require that they attend several different trainings throughout kind of their paperwork process. And then to do the actual home study for our agency, I do 3 different home study visits. I do an initial, and then I do a second, and then I do a third. Those visits, the first one usually lasts about 2 hours. The second one lasts about 4 hours, and the third one lasts about 2 hours. So it's pretty intense. And again, I ask all kinds of questions. I ask questions about trauma. I discuss from their childhood to where they're at now. I talk about their growing up, where they went to elementary school. Tell me what you did for your first job. Like it's kind of wildly invasive. And I love it. I super enjoy doing it. I love asking the questions. I love getting to know our families and really hearing their stories and understanding where they're coming from. And we ask a lot about, like, why are you choosing adoption? Why right now in your life? Why not 2 years ago? Why not 3 years from now? So I do that part. And then I always tell my families at the end of the home study, I'm like, oh, and now your waiting process begins. And here you thought that you have finished the hard part. Everybody thinks that the hard part is the home study process, because it feels very invasive and very judgmental when somebody's coming into your house and writing a 20-page report on you. But that's not always the hard part. The hard part a lot is the waiting period. The waiting period can be anywhere. I have had families where I have hardly had the ink dry on my home study, and I get 2 weeks to write my home study after my final visit. And so I've had families who have been placed literally as soon as that paperwork has gone through. And I have had families that have waited 4+ years. A lot of that depends on their openness. It depends on, some of that depends on the adoptive family's age. It sometimes depends on if they have other children in the home. And sometimes there's no telling what draws a birth family to an adoptive family. So, but the waiting period can be really hard. A lot of times people are like, oh, your home study's done, like your baby's coming, right? And that gets really tricky for our families to navigate sometimes. I have a family right now that I think is going on 3 years of waiting. And I think they thought they were going to be placed really early on. And things have changed within the adoption world a little bit, which I think has set them back. But they have people ask them all the time. Well, and then it's a constant reminder. And then we go every year. So if you've done a home study, I go back once a year to update it. So say you did a home study and I finalized it in January, I come back every January that you haven't been placed. So then when I come, that's really unfun, right? Because they're like, we thought we would have had a baby by now. And I hear that a lot. And so working with families, working through some of those emotions, helping them to handle people who ask inappropriate questions, or people who think that things are their business that are not their business, like really helping families navigate some of those tricky situations and really helping them navigate their own hard parts of that waiting period. I have some families who are like, my nursery's ready. I got everything ready. I got everything we need. Like, just say the word. And other people are like, we're not buying anything. I'm not buying anything. I'll buy a car seat on the way if I have to. And all of those, anything from that to that, are acceptable. And we just work with each and every one of our families on where they're at with those types of things. So the legal process kind of ties in a little bit with the post placement that I was talking about. So it takes 6 months to finalize an adoption in the state of Missouri. Even though those, some of the paperwork has been signed and all of that, we still have to go through our formal process of doing those post placements and making sure everybody and everything is okay. There's a lot to the legal process that I won't necessarily go into because it's really lengthy and really intricate and complex depending on certain situations. Facing the unknowns, that happens.
Hey, Andy?
Yes.
We have a question from Nicole. She asked, do the children ever get to pick the family they would like to be with, or do they not get a say?
Interesting. So intercountry wise, they do not get a say. And the children that I have worked with who would be old enough, I have not worked with any children who were old enough to have a say so. Does that make sense? Similar, like if you were in if there was a custody situation, like I think a child has to be of a certain age, and I'm pretty sure that would be the case as well with adoption. But honestly, I think the oldest child that I have worked with has been 3, and obviously that child would not get a say so. Good question. So a lot of the unknowns, I have many examples of what some of our families have gone through with the process. And some of that, I would say a common example is like a mama says, oh, I really loved this adoptive family from the profile book, met them, maybe started texting, phone calling, FaceTiming, whatever with this family, trying to build a relationship. And then all of a sudden, birth mom can't be reached. We don't hear from, she won't respond to us. She won't respond to the family. That is something we see quite often, and we really try to prepare our families for that. But oftentimes every family that we talk to is like, well, that's not going to be us. Even if they don't say it, that's what they're thinking, right? I would be thinking that, but it happens. And there are a lot of unknowns within the adoption process. We had a case one time where everything was fine. Everything was great. Everything's rolling along. Birth mom and adoptive family got along great. They'd met each other several times. Baby was placed. Baby had been in the home. They show up for their court date for the termination of parental rights. Mom shows up with biological birth father also, and birth father's like, no, that's my baby and I want that baby. There's no leg to stand on. That baby went home with the birth father because of the legalities of that situation, but never in their wildest dreams would that family have ever imagined that that was what was going to happen when they went to court that day. So there's a lot of sadness and a lot of loss within this particular job field. In the post-adoption process, like I talked about, I go in and do a home visit at those intervals that I discussed. And those visits last anywhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours, usually, sometimes longer, depending on how long I've been working with the family. And they like to share a lot with me, which I think can be really fun. And it's really fun to see them thriving as parents, or what challenges they're having as parents, and see how the baby's doing. I talked a little bit about this earlier, the past and the present of the adoption world. And so the past was a lot of confidentiality. Like I said, things were like airtight. You weren't getting in there. You needed a lock and key, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of secrecy about adoption. I've read in a number of different books where people will talk about, like, the mom was sent off to her cousins for the summer and then she came back and it was fine. And oh, but really she had a baby while she was gone, and that baby had been placed into another home. So I think that happened a lot, and maybe still happens some, hopefully not. And then denial of emotions, like it's fine, everybody's fine. We don't need to talk about that. We're just going to brush that under the rug. We're going to pretend that didn't happen. And now, today, there's a lot more ownership of the situation. There's that openness that I talked about, where you can have a lot of communication. You can send text messages, pictures, phone calls, letters, like that can look pretty much any way you could fathom it. And there's a lot of grief and loss, like I kind of mentioned earlier. That's a big piece of this work because you can't have adoption without loss. Okay. So the ultimate question is always for the mama, the pregnant mama, expectant mama, am I ready to be a parent at this point? And so again, one of the things we really like to do is help that parent to make an informed decision of what parenting versus adoption would look like. Some people don't realize that what took place in the past is not what takes place in the present. A lot of people think that if they place their baby for adoption, they will never see that child again, which is absolutely not what we promote and not typically what we do. Now, I do have a few families where the birth family has said, no, we don't want any contact. Don't call us. Don't send pictures. Don't send a letter. If we want contact, we will contact you. And there have been a couple of, within one of those cases, I know they had that the baby had some medical issues. And so then the adoptive family contacted us. We were able to contact the birth family, and the birth family then was able to provide that information that we were then able to provide to the adoptive family with the birth parent's permission to help out the child. And I don't think in that situation, the birth parent had no issue providing that information, but they didn't want to see that. They didn't want to have visits. They didn't want pictures, any of those types of things. We also really like to stress the importance of prenatal care for our expectant mamas. So, you know, if they're going to carry that, if they're going to carry that baby, we would like for them to be receiving proper medical care, nutrition, all of those things that are important for mom and baby. And we also like for them to be able to let somebody know that they're pregnant, because that's extremely lonely, right? So if they don't have anybody that they feel like they can talk to, and they can talk to us in confidence, we would be happy to be that person for them. So again, there's all these options, right? So the expectant mama and the expectant father get to lead the entire process. Again, we talked about that openness. They get to choose the family. So all of our adoptive families put together a profile book, again, about that says all those things about them. And then when our moms are at the point where they're ready to start selecting a family, they then get to go through these books. It's almost like looking at a catalog. And a lot of times they will resonate immediately. They usually resonate immediately with like 2 or 3 families. And then they have an interview with those families, and things kind of go from there. The mama always gets to decide how involved she does or does not want the adoptive family to be in the hospital experience. I think that has changed a little bit recently due to COVID, but I know previously, there have been many a times when our adoptive families have been in the delivery room. There have been other times when they have been outside of the delivery room, all per the wishes of the birth mother. We had one time when I went in and did the post placement, and they were telling me about who all was in the room when the mom was giving birth. And I'm not kidding, they rattled off like 8 or 10 names. And I was like, oh my gosh. But I guess that room accommodated them, and they said it was a wonderful experience. But it was very birth mama driven. So that was terrific. The release of the baby. So parents cannot sign over the release of the baby until 48 hours after delivery. That has to do with giving space and giving time to the birth mom and the birth father, because things are a little different when baby shows up. We try to talk with our mamas all the time about what that experience is going to look like and be like, but until they've experienced, they don't know how they're going to feel. We do highly encourage our mamas to nurse the baby if they want to do skin to skin with the baby, to hold the baby, to see the baby, do all of those things to their comfort level. We've had moms who are like, nope, not doing any of it. They can just, the nurse can take them over to the next room with the adoptive family, and that's what I want. Completely fine. So again, that hospital experience really runs the gamut too. But 48 hours is when they can sign the paperwork. And then again, there's that, the legalities of all of that that take place for about 6 months where they're getting things in place. And then we do those post-placement visits. And then post-adoption, we do offer post-adoption services. So once that 6 months is over, we kind of close things up, but we're always there as a resource for our families. Should something come up, should they have a sticky situation that they want some consultation on. And we do a lot of post-adoption education that we send out to our families for a little bit. And so again, the role of the birth father, that varies by state to state, but we highly encourage them as part of the process that is a very lengthy conversation we could have, because again, it's very complex. Everybody's relationships are very different and very intricate. So we do want them as part of the process as much as possible, because that is what is best for baby and hopefully best for everybody across the board. And sometimes they're wonderful and really wanting to be involved and want to do everything that like the birth mom is doing. And other times we can't contact them or we don't know who they are. And so there's, again, a lot that goes into that piece of things. What questions do you have?
Andy, I had a quick question. You mentioned the costs related to what most people think of adoption, which is, you know, finding someone who wants to give up a child, or finding two individuals who want to give up a child. You know, the more quote unquote traditional versus the foster care adoption. Is the foster care adoption as expensive, or is it less expensive or more expensive?
Yeah, I don't think that it is as expensive. I'm glad that you said that too, because something I forgot to mention is there are lots of grants that you can apply for once you have adopted or in the adoption process. And I would say probably 90% of our families apply and receive some type of grant for financial assistance. A lot of our families also do different types of fundraising events to a lot of times through their churches or through their families or good friends. Like somebody had a pancake breakfast one time, yard sales, those types of things. But I do think foster care is a little bit on the cheaper side. Again, I think that depends on a couple of different factors. But yeah, I do think foster care is actually also where the need absolutely is right now. As I mentioned, kind of a lot of countries are closing their doors to intercountry adoption. So that is becoming a less viable option that I think was really done a lot in the past. And as we're moving forward, that's not occurring as much. I can also tell you that domestic adoption is down across the state. That has been a trend in the last several years. I don't know why that is necessarily. I talked with my supervisor about this the other day, and we have some theories, but nothing that is solidified or panned out. But foster care is absolutely where the adoption need is right now.
Dan asks, you said you usually work with young children. Is that typical for the state?
It has been with my agency. So my particular agency does not have a contract with the state of Missouri. So our particular agency does not do the foster care in the state of Missouri. I am familiar with it only through a couple of our families who have done both, and through some friends who have done both. But for our particular agency, yes, typically we do domestic infant adoption or intercountry adoption. Again, I do think that's fairly typical. And again, a lot of people would really like that full gamut experience of having the baby all the way to adulthood. But there is absolutely a need for an older child adoption. And then as the child gets older, there tends to be siblings. So again, in the foster care system, older children and sibling sets is where a need is right now.
Andy, I had one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the grants, and I actually have some friends who are going through the adoption process now, and I kind of watched the whole journey. And I was watching their Facebook as they were talking about the cost related to going and visiting their adoptive children. And someone said, "Oh, apply for a grant." They're like, "There's grants?" So do you know of any grants that people who are on this or going to be watching later, can you think of any grants or direct anyone to any grants? Because I know that's not something that I knew about and my friends didn't know about until like 2 years into the process.
So that, for my particular role at my agency, that is a piece that takes place after I have kind of stepped out. So it is not one that I know the names of them off the top of my head. If someone would like that information, I would be happy to find out from my supervisor what those are and pass that along. And I'll tag my email here in the chat in a minute. But that's a great question, because there's absolutely ways of funding adoption I think that people aren't necessarily aware of.
Shay asked, why are foreign countries closing their doors to American families? And also, Andy, I put your email in the chat for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So that is a very interesting question and something that I am kind of keeping an eye on because I'm very interested in that as well. And I think some of it does have to do with they are trying to keep doing more in-country adoption and some of the foster care so that they can do more of the reunification. And honestly, kind of from what I can tell, I do think some of it is probably political in nature. But I don't have any 100% evidence on that, but kind of from the inklings that I have gotten from our global office, that there's a lot of political pieces that are coming into play with that as well.
To piggyback off of that, Andy, I actually know an anthropologist who looks at international adoptions, and you're right on. There are quite a few countries that are wanting to keep things more insular and actually build off the American model of trying to reunite families and that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of politics, some of it being that they're wanting to get rid of corruption that had happened previously, and some of it is also the American outlook is not very positive right now, so they're looking to adopt out to other countries.
Yep. Very good. Thank you.
Someone asked, doesn't have a name, do you know of or have any resources specifically for kinship adoptions?
So if you're here locally in mid-Missouri, gosh, I'm going to mess up their name. So it is Central Missouri Foster Care and Adoption Association. I would 100% look them up. They are here in Jeff City, I think located over off of Swiss Highway. They have a huge program. They do a lot of kinship work. They have a specific kinship program. They have a ton of resources for kinship families or families who are interested in kinship adoption. And I think they would be able to help someone start that process. If there are, oh, I see, did something else flash?
Is reunification less likely if you're a minority or AA? I'm assuming African American.
I do not have any statistics on that. I've never seen that before. It would be very interesting to know what the statistics are on that. That's a really good question. In my experience, we do a lot of interracial placements, and honestly, we do a lot of white adoptive families with African American or mixed race children. I have done many Caucasian children to Caucasian families. I have never actually worked with an African American adoptive family, though. I know we have some because I've seen their profile books, but I have not. And I kind of cover our mid-Missouri area.
This is more of a comment. Shay mentioned that CFCAA, which is that organization you mentioned, is a great resource for kinship adoption and those interested in foster care.
Yes, they are terrific. And again, if you need their contact information, you can email me, and we have some contacts over there that we utilize for different things that I would be happy to send your way if you're interested. Well, I think that I talked about longer probably than Dr. Boston told me I could, and you guys did great with questions, and thank you so much for joining in. I really appreciate you guys all being here. And again, thank you to Dr. Boston and Lincoln University and the library for having me. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Thank you so much.
And before everyone goes, please be aware that we do have a Facebook group for this lecture series. Lincoln MRRL lecture series. It is linked on the Facebook page for this event, and you can also just if you email Andy, she knows how to reach me, and I can send her the info as well. Sorry, Andy, I'm giving you extra work. But we do run these lectures throughout the year. We have one once a month, and our next one is in February. I forgot to look up the date, but it's actually a health-oriented one looking at cholesterol. So for those of us who get yelled at by our doctor doctors regularly for not taking care of ourselves, or just interested in taking better care of ourselves or learning more about cholesterol, please check that out. It'll be in February. And also Andy's email address is in the chat several times, so please grab that before we close out if you want to contact her.
All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and try to do my technological piece. You guys have a great evening.